Hello, and welcome to Raising the Bar with the MBBA. I'm your co-host, Adeola Adejobi.
And I'm Jason Clark, president of the Metropolitan Black Bar Association. For those of you who aren't familiar with our organization, the Metropolitan Black Bar Association is the largest association of predominantly African-American attorneys in New York. Our goal is to advance equality in the pursuit of justice, assist in the professional development of our members, and address legal issues affecting New Yorkers.
The goal of Raising the Bar with the MBBA is to foster a substantive conversation about justice issues in our community and to try to identify a couple of solutions in the process.
Today, we're going to talk about the CCRB, the Civilian Complaint Review Board, and the role of disciplinary hearings in regards to police misconduct.
And we will get an update on the administrative hearing for the police officer who choked and killed Eric Garner. Eric Garner died in a confrontation with NYPD officers in 2014. His dying words, "I can't breathe," became a slogan for Black Lives Matter.
Joining us now are Cynthia Cook-Conti and Lance Clark. Welcome, and let's get started. So we've recently heard about some new developments when it comes to the case regarding Eric Garner, and at least the law enforcement officer who's accused of leading to his death. Cynthia, can you tell us a little bit about where we are with those things and what the next steps are?
Sure. The CCRB did an investigation, and they found that an unlawful chokehold was used to kill Eric Garner.
And that's the Civilian Complaint Review Board?
That's the Civilian Complaint Review Board, sorry. And the Civilian Complaint Review Board, through a memorandum of understanding with the NYPD, is allowed to act as the prosecutor in the administrative trial room where Daniel Pantaleo is being prosecuted. The administrative trial room does not result in a criminal conviction or a sentence that involves imprisonment or anything that we generally think of as happening after a criminal case or a criminal trial is heard. But his potential penalty could be as severe as termination from the NYPD, and that is really the most significant penalty that could come from this trial. There are many other less significant outcomes that could result from this administrative trial.
And Lance, I guess, can you tell us a little bit more, because we're hearing about the CCRB, like what is the role of the CCRB, and what role does it play when folks are trying to figure out ways to deter police misconduct?
Sure. So the CCRB was put there so when civilians feel that they have been harassed by the police, falsely arrested, and their allegation of police misconduct, there is an avenue there where they can go and report these cases to. And the CCRB will do an investigation internally to see if these claims are substantiated or if they're not substantiated. And then there's another process to see what happens then. And I think Cynthia hit it on the head. The most severe thing that can happen in this particular case is a loss of this officer's job. And unfortunately, the most severe thing hardly ever happens and when NYPD officers are found to have used excessive force, found to have arrested someone without probable cause. Maybe a loss of vacation days, maybe a suspension, maybe desk duty. But we're talking about one human being lost their life, and the worst thing that can happen to the person who caused that human being to lose their life is a loss of their employment. That is the real problem, I think, that's not being discussed. But, there's still, 5 months left for the feds, for statute of limitations for the federal government to bring a case. If you have any confidence in the federal government run by what's being run by now, if they will bring, charges against this officer federally.
And so talking a little bit more about the Civilian Complaint Review Board, it's, I'm sure the vast majority of New Yorkers don't necessarily know that it exists. So now that they do, by watching this show, I guess what are the initial steps that someone would take in order to get before the board?
Well, you can file a complaint online. You can call them and ask for an appointment, or you can just go in there. I believe that the CCRB has made some improvements lately in making their intake process more accessible. And I believe that if you have some physical disability or not able to reach the CCRB yourself and make it down to 100 Church Street, that they will come to you if you ask them to.
Okay, and so when somebody files a complaint, does that give them any type of protections? Because I would assume that, most citizens would probably be afraid to do it because they might feel that they would get some sort of retaliation.
I would like to think so, yes, but I have definitely heard of clients saying that they've been harassed after filing a complaint against an officer, not always by that specific officer, himself or herself, but sometimes by other officers in the precinct.
I would go farther and say, of course, there are no protections against these people who file these complaints. And to think that you can file a complaint against a person in power and not expect to be retaliated, I think is just a lack of common sense. The person who filmed the situation with Eric Garner, there was retaliation in that instance for that case. Imagine, and this was a media case that was known all over the world. Imagine what's happening on the regular cases with these guys in Brownsville and in Queensbridge when they get beat up and then someone files a complaint with the CCRB. Imagine what's happening with those people.
So then if there are no protections, I just have to ask the questions here. And the only thing that's going to happen is someone's going to get fired, then I guess from the citizen standpoint, like what's the value of the board then?
Well, fired versus nothing. I guess you have to take what you can get, unfortunately. I'll let you speak more on it.
Part of the value I completely sympathize with and understand why people don't want to come forward, because it definitely does put them in jeopardy and further makes them feel like they could be isolated and harassed by people that are capable of not only carrying weapons but also capable of, on their word alone, throwing you in jail. And that is an absolutely intimidating reality. However, I do encourage people to make civilian complaints because it is the only discipline that is often available. If the investigation finds that the conduct rises to the level of criminality, you could go to a prosecutor's office and ask for a prosecution to also occur. That is usually unlikely because the prosecutors usually cooperate so closely with the NYPD that they do not seriously consider bringing charges against officers for what other people just walking down the street easily would be prosecuted for. But it is so important, and as we saw with Daniel Pantaleo, it is so important to know that an officer did have a history of misconduct when this type of incident occurs. If you look in Chicago, when the video of Laquan McDonald being basically executed in the back of his head was aired finally, and the public saw what happened, there was no back and forth about, well, what did Laquan McDonald do to deserve that? Because Jason Van Dyke, the officer who killed him, it was known publicly because of the Invisible Institute and the work of the Citizens Public Data Project that he had had 20 prior similar complaints. And that changed the narrative from the beginning, and that is what is important. We know when the NYPD kills someone, the next thing that you hear on the news is what that person's arrest record was. That same kind of transparency doesn't exist for police officers in their misconduct histories because of Civil Rights Law 50A. And we're asking 50A to be repealed right now. And that is really the difference between us knowing when an incident like Mr. Garner's death happens, whether the officer had a history of misconduct, in order to match the narrative that the police are putting out there about the arrest history of whomever was killed.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit more, can you talk a little bit more about the law that you are trying to get repealed now so that the public has more of an idea?
Absolutely. Civil Rights Law 50A was passed in 1976 by heavy lobbying with the prosecutors and the police unions. It was after Map v. Ohio was found by the Supreme Court, so now there's suppression hearings in Gideon v. Wainwright. So now you have public defenders in court demanding officers testify about the basis for stops and searches and seizures in suppression hearings. And that was only happening for the last 15 years. Freedom of information laws started to be passed in 1974 in New York State, and right on the heels of freedom information laws, the police unions came and said, we can't have defense attorneys doing freedom of information requests on our personnel records and finding out if there's any civilian complaints against us. So in 1976, the New York State legislature passed this law, but it was only about whether defense counsel can get access to the entire personnel record of an officer in order to cross-examine them or impeach them during a suppression hearing, for example. But the question of whether the public should be able to access basic disciplinary information about officers was actually never debated on the floor of the legislature. But through terrible court interpretations of Civil Rights Law 50A, we are now in a situation where we cannot, even while we're going to the Eric Garner and Daniel Pantaleo hearing and watching it live, we cannot know that we will learn the result of what happens because the courts have interpreted Civil Rights Law 50A so detrimentally broadly.
The funny thing, if I remember this correctly, when we're talking about Civil Rights Law 50A, is that it's not something that has necessarily had been enforced, until the Eric Garner incident. I mean, and both of you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I felt like it was there was some type of salutary neglect where when people asked for this information, it was provided, and then all of a sudden after this controversial death had occurred, all of a sudden this information wasn't provided anymore.
The information was actually available regularly to reporters through the Deputy Commissioner of Public Information's office. There was a summary on a clipboard that was hanging outside the office, and every quarter it was updated with the disciplinary penalties and the summaries of misconduct, along with the officer's name. Those summaries were archived in the City Hall archives from 1972 until 2016, when I did a FOIL request asking for 5 years of those summaries.
Good job.
And so you're right. That information generally had been available to reporters. However, once we did a formal FOIL request for it, they suddenly said, sorry, we need to interpret this law much more expansively than we've been interpreting it for the past 42 years. And we are going to now say that this information, this law not only covers the personnel records of police officers, but it covers even the yes or no question, or even the yes or no answer to, does this officer have misconduct in their history that's been substantiated through an investigation?
A lot of times when there are cases like this, I mean, they don't always get to this point when they're substantiated by the CCRB, though I believe that they've been doing a lot more. There are a lot more cases that are substantiated now than they had been in the past. But, let's say in a lot of ways it seems like this is the best outcome, at least in this, at least for someone who files a complaint. Someone files a complaint with the CCRB, is found substantiated, and in this case, it seems like the CCRB is going to be handling the prosecution. Now that that's occurred, and I'm trying to think just globally about other cases or someone else who may find themselves in a similar situation, what should people be expecting? What should people be looking for? And just what is to come?
Well, you would hope that through the CCRB hearings with Officer Pantaleo that it would discourage other officers from similar conduct. And you would hope that it would discourage the brutality that a lot of socioeconomically disenfranchised neighborhoods have been going through. I'm just not as optimistic as a lot of other people that this will occur. This is a pattern of behavior that has been happening in this country, in this city, in this borough for countless amount of years. You would hope that he loses his job, because that's the worst thing you can hope for right now, and it's horrible that that's the worst thing that we can ask for, is that this man lose his job, which I should state doesn't prevent him from working for another police department somewhere else.
Would that prevent him from being able to work in another police department in New York? Wow.
No.
Okay.
It's you're asking for so little, and a big victory here is the bare minimum: this man losing his job. And will that discourage other officers from the same conduct? I don't think so. If the worst thing that can happen is me losing my job and I can get another job at another department, what's the big thing?
Right. So another thing that this kind of just makes me think of, it almost has, I think about, the Central Park 5 and, just other, notorious cases where it seems like there was that justice didn't occur. And I know that at least in some of those cases, even if it was later on, they're able to settle them if someone brought a civil lawsuit. Now that this is going through this venue, through the CCRB, and there's going to be a prosecution, let's say I was someone and I found myself in a similar situation like this, or I had a loved one who passed away in a similar situation to this. Let's say the prosecution, well, actually, both questions. One is, let's say the prosecution does end up terminating the officer, or two, let's say it doesn't. Does that preclude me from being able to bring a civil lawsuit myself? At least as another way of trying to get
No, not at all.
institution?
In fact, with Eric Garner, the civil case was settled some time ago. The NYPD just never did anything to reprimand the officer who was responsible for all the money that the city had to pay because of his, criminal actions and the loss of Eric Garner's life. But I mean, one thing has nothing to do with the other. There are a lot of cases where the city does not, even with the Central Park 5, even with the $41 million that they settled out, they never stipulated that they did anything wrong. They just cut the check for the $41 million. And that may sound like a lot of money, but loss of freedom, there's not a quantifiable number or price you can put on that. These innocent boys, and I use the term boys, since they were boys, spent the better part of their life incarcerated for something that they did not do, and they got a check for it. Because that's really all what happened. They got a check for it.
Yeah. So certainly there is a lot of work that's being done, reviewing what's going to happen with Civil Rights Law 50A. In addition to that, are there other things or other solutions that should be pursued that can make sure that when there is some type of police misconduct, that there is recourse and there is a way to be able to find justice for the family?
Yes. I mean, in addition to repealing 50A, another bill that is currently in the Safer New York package includes making the special prosecutor of the Attorney General stronger, so that when someone is killed by a police officer, that they do not have to rely on a local prosecutor in order to press charges against the officer. They can go to the special prosecutor who is more specialized in prosecuting police officers and not burdened by the local conflicts of needing to cooperate with local NYPD. And so pushing the special prosecutor bill and the other portions of the Safer New York Act, like the Repeal 50A bill, are really important for New Yorkers to get behind.
It's so important, what you just stated, for the special prosecutor, because prosecutors get indictments every day. It's so easy to get a grand jury to indict. It's so easy, except if it's a police officer. So you have to first get them to bring a case, to charge the officer, which is extremely hard, because if we're working together, law enforcement and the district attorney's office work hand in hand. So you're asking me now to charge someone who I've worked with for 5, 10, 15 years with the crime. Fine, you get past that hurdle. Now you have to present the case to the grand jury. Now, I've been doing this job for a very long time, and with 90-odd% cases that go before the grand jury, there's an indictment. But when the case is presented with an officer, somehow the district attorney forgets how to do their job. And it's always a no true bill when it comes to the officer. And why is that? It's exactly what Cynthia said. It's because they lean on each other for so long. You need a special prosecutor because they're specialized in it, but because they're independent. There is no real independence between the district attorney's office and the police department.
And actually, if my memory serves me correct, so there wasn't a special prosecutor, or at least the Attorney General's office was not responsible for being a special prosecutor when there are lethal encounters with police officers and the communities before this Eric Garner case. So that's probably a big reason why there wasn't maybe a special prosecutor assigned to a case like this.
Right, it was a Staten Island prosecutor who did not get an indictment because they basically put on Pantaleo's defense. If I am speculating, no one has access to those grand jury minutes. The Legal Aid Society did do a motion trying to get access to those grand jury minutes, but that was also kept secret from the public, as was Daniel Pantaleo's misconduct history until it was leaked to a paper.
I want to take it back really quickly to the CCRB. Who has the burden of proof, one, and then two, taking it back to people filing complaints. Can they file complaints anonymously?
No, people cannot file complaints anonymously, and there is, in the Eric Garner case, some controversy over whether the person who filed a complaint was the PBA is trying to argue that that person cannot file the complaint on behalf of Eric Garner, who obviously can't file the complaint on behalf of himself. But people in other cities can file anonymous civilian complaints, but no, not in New York City.
Is it not in New York City, but yes in Queens, or yes in, or you talk about 5 boroughs or all of New York City?
5
Okay.
boroughs, yeah. And to answer your first question, the burden of proof is on the Civilian Complaint Review Board for the administrative trial. But unlike a criminal trial where you have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, in the administrative trial it's just a preponderance standard, which is sort of a 51%, a much lesser, a less high burden than in a criminal trial.
Okay.
So, in the last couple minutes that we have left, one question that I have, I just remember when, the Eric Garner case was being heard about. We were talking about Akai Gurley. We're hearing about all of these, it was one after the other where it seemed like there was some type of lethal encounter, especially with individuals of color and police officers. have things changed? Have things gotten better? It certainly doesn't seem like there are as many high-profile cases out there, but does that mean that there are less complaints of use of excessive force or less incidences where, individuals who, who had been shot or killed, or, what is it? I mean, I'm seeing you shaking your head. So
I'd say absolutely not.
No. This is the pattern that this country has been on, and the course that this country has been on since the inception of it. We see more of it now because of technology. But for every one video you see, there's 5 people getting shot, and there's no video that substantiates why they got shot. For every one encounter you hear about of someone getting pulled over, 10 more people are getting pulled over. Personally, I was pulled over 2 years ago, coming back from giving a speech, and they put guns in my face and my son's face, who was 4 years old, who was sitting in the back seat. And this is an everyday thing you have to deal with as a person of color, because socioeconomics doesn't shield you from that. Because when you get pulled over in a nice car, the only thing they see is the person that's driving the car. And how do you stop that? Except if you stop the thinking and the mentality of the supremacy thinking in this country that one person is better than another just based on the color of their skin. I say that to say that there are times when you put on that blue uniform, your thinking changes. Meaning that a lot of black officers pull over a lot of black people and there's a lot of police misconduct done by black officers to, black defendants who are driving cars as well. So to answer your question, has it slowed down? No. Will it stop? Never. How do we fix it? And there are smarter people than me in the world that could probably figure that out, because I haven't. And I've spent the greater portion of my life, I was working at the Legal Aid Society for a very long time. And it's like the machine that's keep going and going and going. And it's, what do you do?
Yeah, and actually, as you mentioned that, there's this idea that we have body cameras, and we like to think that things are getting better. I know that was a big part of it. I mean, just quickly before we get to our credits, do you think that that's something that's going to help or has been helping, or is that just, there are other things that we need to do to try to make things better?
Body cameras are just another tool that police officers are slowly learning how to manipulate. And we have seen them turned over in our cases, but it's still taking months and months for us to get body camera footage, even in a litigation case. Now, the NYPD says that you can access body camera footage that you have been taped on by doing a simple FOIL request. But again, the PBA has tried to interfere with this by claiming that even body camera footage is covered by Civil Rights Law 50A, and trying to say that that constitutes a personnel record. They lost that argument in court. But at the same time, the absolute slowness of getting access to those records, to those recordings ourselves, does not assist in the project of transparency. What will assist in the project of transparency is repealing the Civil Rights Law 50A, because so importantly, we have to be able to understand the misconduct histories of the officers that are walking around our neighborhoods with guns and the ability to haul you off into court and say that you've broken a law.
Just quickly, body cameras only work if they're turned on. And 2, I think that we have to control the narrative out there, because you can see a tussle between an officer and a civilian on body camera, and the argument will be made that, he was a risk and the officer was a threat for his life. I think you have to change the narrative that all young men of color do not pose a threat to law enforcement's life.
Yes, and that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for watching Raising the Bar with the MBBA on the Manhattan Neighborhood Network.